Hey class, we're back to part 2 of chapter 9, Byzantium. You should be reading the chapter 256 through 283. Last time we left off with the Hagia Sophia. We talked quite a bit about it, and we had also talked a lot about the mosaics inside the Ravenna church, San Vitale. So we're going to be kind of moving on in time and towards the middle Byzantine era in this lecture in the late one. I want to talk a bit about the mosaics, the politics of icons and imagery in this part of the world, and how we can see them play out in the Hagia Sophia mosaics under a period of time, over a period of time. So we're going to look at a couple different pieces. And there's this terminology you'll see in your book, iconoclasm, and also iconophiles. This is a period of time in which icons, which means image in Greek, were being destroyed, and there was a lot of controversy over them. And these are the type of things that we're talking about when we talk about icons. Oftentimes, though, really they are small portable paintings depicting Christ, the Virgin, or saints, or a combination of them. And to Byzantine Orthodox Christians, icons were religious images that were like a window that you were praying into towards a figure, not to a figure, but a window into the world that you were praying towards. They had a lot of personal significance as a medium for interaction with divine and these personalities, these saints. And there was a whole crazy long controversy in this part of the world over the fact that this was idolatry to a lot of people. And so this idea started to become where there was a power being attributed to them. And some people were saying too much power, so they decided to start destroying them, basically. And um, and out of that, even there was kind of even a political element to it, where the power of the state over the church and the church and the state were kind of pushing back and forth with each other. And Church Leo the Third had a belief that God was punishing for them for this, so that was why they were losing territory to the Muslims, for example. So it was a very complex issue. But iconoclasm basically means breaker of images, and this one means lover of images. So it's a period of time between 750 and 850, a 100-year upheaval in the empire, where there was an imperial ban on making icons and sacred images, and there was even edicts ordering the destruction of them. So it went so far as to have icon painters, who were often monks, murdered, and icons were destroyed in a very bitter spiritually related war. It kind of could seem silly to us in a way now, potentially, but if we pause and think about it for a minute, these are their ideas about God and how they're supposed to be worshiping Him. And these type of ideas very much affect world politics even now, and have created and do create wars and all types of things even now. So it's not really that crazy of an idea when we stop and think about it, that these were things about power and the government and the state and church, and also about what people believed was right and wrong. And so it created a really intense battle, basically, in a way. Because of the destruction of a lot of these works, there's difficulty for art historians because they're not existing anymore. Part of the thing that happened because of this, the monks fled the Byzantine Empire, and so then they were able to go to other parts of Europe, and they influenced the art of the West quite a lot. And eventually, though, there was a triumph of icons in this part of the world, Orthodox Christianity, and a rejection of some of the other politics and ideas. And so um, they were finally accepted, and they are still used today in some places. So Theodora was Theodora eventually got rid of the issues and convened a religious council that permanently put an end to iconoclasm, and she was sainted because of it. So this is an example of one that was in the apse in Hagia Sophia. It was a new mosaic added to it post-iconoclasm by Basil I, the head of the Macedonian dynasty that we'll hear about. He wanted to be the restorer of the Roman Empire, and he denounced Charlemagne, who was kind of his contemporary that we'll see in a later chapter, and his Holy Roman Empire, because he said he's a faker, he's the real Roman emperor. This is under the dome, and it's a 16-foot tall seated figure and an older Christ child than we often see. The inscription is that the pious emperors, the Macedonians, commissioned the mosaic to replace the one that the impostors had destroyed, the iconoclasts. So we can see here a pretty political idea too, in that the state eventually said, no, it's okay, and then made the church believe that and do that as well. So it goes in a lot of different directions, power. This is another one that was also in the Hagia Sophia from later on. It's a mosaic on the east wall of the south gallery. It's a portrait of, you can see Christ in the middle, and then you can see two people. They both also have halos. Christ is between Empress Zoe and Constantine IX. And pretty interesting. You can see the style is very similar to a lot of them. He has more realism, and they have a lot more patterning in their outfits. There's a big change here, putting the human with divine. With Justinian, the idea was there, but him and Theodora were on separate mosaics, not next to Christ, in the same mosaic, right? And the Theodora, I meant to say, who finally put an end to iconoclasm, it was not the Theodora from before, from Justinian's wife. This was a later Theodora. So this is much later that iconoclasm's happening. You can see she's holding a scroll and he's holding money. A reference to gifts to the church is possibly an old mosaic that was updated with new faces when they were married. Because Zoe was an interesting character. She had a pretty intense history. She was a daughter of an emperor, and then she married and then possibly killed her husband to be with another guy who became emperor. Then they adopted a son who became emperor and banished her to a convent when he came to power. And then she came back, ruled in her own name for a bit, and then married this guy in the portrait. So there's possibly his face has been changed a few times. But you can see different ideas of iconoclasm being happening here, or places where icons were destroyed and have been repaired, or new ones have been put in place. So this is kind of an interesting building in relationship to this. This was a post-iconoclastic image in the Hagia Sophia. It was actually uncovered from under plaster, part of a larger mosaic with Mary on the left and John the Baptist on the right, which is a common thing we'll see later in the Haberville triptych, for example. But this is typical of the style with the icon, the frontal style. We'll see Jesus with a jeweled book, gospel book in this gesture, his right hand blessing. This is typical that we're going to see this a lot of times. Large frontal eyes, not anatomically correct, but representational. A body that's not idealized or necessarily physically beautiful, because the soul is more important. There's a lot of flatness, and some shadowing a bit, but not a lot. And usually a lot of gold used in these things because the incarnation, God incarnate, him being God in human flesh, that's the kind of idea we're going to show. A lot of times a lot of gold to be about holiness and God's presence. So we're going to see commonalities going on here over and again. We're going to look for a bit at manuscript and icon painting. This manuscript painting is often called also illumination, where it makes them more beautiful. In the medieval times, books were handwritten, they were expensive to create, so much so that many monasteries would not even have had a complete Bible. And the primary book that people were recreating, and by recreating I mean copying in new versions, new actual, not new versions like as in material or written words, but copying it to have a new book, a new version of the book with new paintings and things, took a really long time. And so literacy is very low at this time in history. There wasn't a printing press until 1440. So um, there was a whole groups of people who would have been a part of this, oftentimes monks and nuns, and they would have had specialized jobs writing and decorating. They would do sometimes some liturgical literature, which would be used for the services. So parts of the Bible that were reordered to go for the church calendar, the services they would do throughout the calendar. And then a couple other types of things like that, like blessings from saints and bishops and stuff. But mostly they would be doing the Bible. The Bible, it literally means as a translation book or the book. Arguably the most influential book on Western civilization or even the history of the world. Just especially the Western world. The New Testament is made up of the four Gospels, which means good news, and the story narrative of the birth and ministry and death and resurrection of Christ. And then the Acts of the Apostles, which is the story history of the early church and the apostles. And then there's a number of letters that are called epistles written by early church fathers like Paul, and then the apostles Peter, James, John, James, the brother of Jesus. And then there's also apocalyptic prophecy literature in the book of Revelation. So you'll hear a lot of, I'm talking to you a lot about this because we'll see a lot of the scenes that we're going to be see illustrated in the next books are from the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, but also a lot of the things we're going to see in the next chapters are in the stained glass windows, and different things are in reference to it. So we're going to look at some illuminated manuscripts, mostly Bibles from the Byzantine culture. And then after that, we're going to look at some icons and different buildings. Some of them are outside of Constantinople, and a few of them are actually in other territories, so to speak, especially the Venetian one. We'll look at St. Mark's. These first images are from the Vienna Genesis, which is Byzantine culturally. Its functional book, it is the Bible to be read, a book of the Bible, Genesis being the first book of the Bible, and part of the Pentateuch of the Old Testament and Jewish scripture as well as Christian. It's made with tempera, which is egg yolk with pigment in it. It's on purple vellum, which was the imperial cloth, like a distinct color, very costly material, in a style that's reminiscent of what we've seen. We see kind of some influence of Rome and older Roman things in the way the city is shown, and some architectural elements. This nude woman here, semi-nude woman, is a personification, so made as a person, a personification being maybe like an attribute or place or different things made into a person of a spring or well. Okay, so she's meant to be the well. And this character, this is a continuous sort of narrative of the same character, who is Rebecca, and this is Eliezer at the well. It comes from Genesis 24:15 through 16, which is Abraham and Isaac. When you think of Abraham, he's the father of the Jewish nation. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac is Abraham's son, and Jacob is Isaac's son. So Abraham was promised a son in Genesis by God in his old age. And he had a son of promise, Isaac, which we've talked about him being like a type of Christ and the reference to his sacrifice happening in the catacombs quite a bit. Well, they wanted a wife from him from Sarah's people, so they sent their servant, he's seen here, and these are all of his camels, on a journey to find a wife for Isaac. And he prayed for a sign that the woman would offer to serve him to draw water, which was a difficult task for him and all his camels. As we know, camels don't drink all the time, so drawing water for them would be a really big task. And so she's coming to the well, and she does that, and she draws the water, and that is a sign. And then she does, Rebecca becomes Isaac's wife. So this is an example of illumination, adding decoration and highlighting part of the Bible. Why would they bother to do this, you think to yourself? It's called the Vienna Genesis because it's located in Vienna, not because of culturally it being Austrian. Why would they do this? You think to yourself, this is a lot of work. Well, they're already putting in so much work to hand copy this whole book of the Bible. Imagine if you had to copy by hand your entire textbook. Just think for a minute about how much labor that would be. Well, it's the same here. Every book has to be done that way. And so if they're going to do it, they're also going to add things to it, like illustrations. Not to mention, they believe, like many people even now still believe, that the Bible is the Word of God. And so because of that, they want to make it beautiful and illuminate it. This is another scene from the Vienna Genesis. Another example of the style. You can see commonality with the continuous narrative here of the figures moving with the architectural space, moving left to right, and then coming back. It's a story of Jacob. Another example is Jacob tricks his dad into giving him the blessing and Esau into selling his birthright. He has to run away because his life has been threatened by his brother. He works for Laban and is tricked into marrying Leah, and then continues to work so he can marry Rachel, the daughter of Laban who he loves. And he has to leave at one point. He chooses to leave, and then they kind of chase after him a bit because his wife steals something from her father. And then he ends up, right here is one of the crucial scenes, wrestling for a blessing. And his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. The nation of Israel is named after him. He's blessed by wrestles with an angel in the middle, and his name is changed. So, important scene from the Old Testament, illustrated. You can see another example of this different style, but still keeping with Byzantine. This one is from 6th century. The last one was from early 6th century, so close in time. They're both using tempera on the purple vellum and some gold leafing. Silver. This one has tempera, gold, and silver on it. This one doesn't have as much of that. It's from Rosano Gospel, and this is the most popular books to translate and also make copies of were the Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the narrative of the life of Christ. It's to be read, and again, same type of things going on here with the beauty and power of the book for them, and to illustrate it and also to illuminate it. Christ is standing before the Jews and Pilate. The Jews have accused him before Pilate, and Pilate is washing his hands here of the whole matter because he's giving them over. He believes Jesus to be innocent, but he's letting the Sanhedrin crucify Christ anyway. Here's Christ. You can see the mandorla over his head and the sort of characteristic style. There's a little bit more of a three-quarter view and a little more shading, but overall very similar. These are people accusing him. So this is before he's going to be taken and crucified. Really beautiful painting, actually, style. This one especially, I think, It has a little bit more, but you still get the floating feet. It has a little more modeling in the values, but not a lot. Very similar. But it's an interesting one. Ascension of Christ from the Rabula Gospels, named after the Syriac monk who created the book and translated it into Syriac. Um, there's a lot of symbolism happening here, whereas these two are more like illustrations or depictions of the narrative, like what's happening in a continuous narrative or what's happening before Pilate. This is more of a conceptual combination of ideas, and it's in a gospel, but the actual scene of Christ ascending is from the book of Acts, which is written by Luke the Evangelist, the second part of his gospel, and then the book of Acts. So it's not actually from the gospel, but this scene is put in the gospel. It has a lot more symbolism, and it's kind of split in two parts of him ascending from earth. Mary wasn't recorded as, this is Mary, mother of Jesus, wasn't recorded as being there. And she's seen in the pose of an orant, if you remember, the raised hands. Let me draw on it so it's clear. Here she is, her raised hands. We remember that word orant. And then there's still, she has the halo, and he does, and then the angels do as well. And these are supposed to be the different 500 people who witnessed him historically, and to actually ascend. And you can see it's kind of separated down the middle, as in the heavens and the earth. Interestingly, she's looking out at the viewer, and everyone else is looking upward, right? So there's some way in which she's being also in the middle, just directly below Christ, highlighted, but not as much as Christ. So we can see already the importance of Mary in this time period, and the importance she's taking on in the Orthodox Church as well as the Roman Catholic Church. There's a lot of artistic interpretation, though. Like I said, he's rising on like a fiery chariot. You get the kind of ideas of wheels within wheels here. That comes from, in your book on page 270, it says it comes from Ezekiel and Revelations, but Ezekiel didn't write the book of Revelation. The Apostle John did, so there's a little bit of a mess up in your book. But Ezekiel is Old Testament, and there's an idea of, in there, a prophecy of the image of 4 living creatures in a chariot to be the presence of God and the throne of God. And an implication of the chariot as well is the second coming of Christ. So there's kind of a lot of things coming in here about maybe he's going, but he's coming back. There's also, you see right here, these 4 creatures that the 4 living creatures have been reinterpreted by this monk as being the 4 evangelists, the gospel writers. Not reinterpreted, I should say, added to it. The eyes are characteristic of this chariot. So he's including the idea of the man, ox, lion, and eagle, which are symbols of the 4 gospel writers, and blending that in. And then the angels are characteristic of the ascension as well as Ezekiel. So there's kind of idea of him going and coming back, all being brought together, as well as his presence coming, which is part of the book of Acts, the Pentecost. So there's a lot of kind of things being melded together in one thing, one image, a very complex symbology, which a lot of people in this era would be able to read and understand that idea. This is interesting. This border is very much sort of like a mosaic, and there's like a tie into the mosaic work. This possibly was inspired by a mosaic that he saw in one of the churches. They're not sure totally, people aren't totally sure, but there's an idea that maybe that is true based on this border and some of the other things. So, pretty interesting piece. We still get some of the same feeling of the feet kind of rising up, like the spirit's more important, and definitely a lot of conceptual ideas mixed in with some sort of feeling of real space in a way, but not like mostly done through overlapping. And but it's beautifully done piece. Um, okay, that kind of takes us through, I think, the majority of the books. Yeah, there's one other piece of that one, and then we'll look at the icons. This is from the same gospel, Rabula Gospel from Syria, and the top shows the death. These are the people gambling for his clothes. The Roman soldier who pierces the side to make sure he's dead with the water and blood coming out. The people who are there, the Virgin and John, and some of the other women that are described as being there. The two thieves on each side. Um, and then down below is the resurrection, the empty tomb. And it sort of has a playing out of the angel telling the two women who came to the tomb, the empty tomb, and then Christ over here showing up. So it's kind of a continuous narrative like we saw with the earlier ones, playing into that sort of style. Again, he's using that kind of mosaic idea around the edges. We get a similar color palette we saw before. Interesting, uses yellow and purple, complementary colors, and also royalty, right? And does it in a few spots over Mary, like he did before. And he's using oranges on blue background to make things stand out. So it's a pretty complex handling of color in different ways. Interesting piece. Okay, we'll look at some icons. Encaustic on wood is wax with pigment on wood. And these, you kind of see a different style emerging. They're going to talk quite a bit in the book about the monastery of St. Catherine in Mount Sinai, Egypt. It was an important early monastery said to be the site of where God spoke to Moses from the burning bush in Genesis. The monastery was rebuilt by Justinian. Monasticism is a spiritual life to join a communal living away from the city, burdens, temptations, and distractions for prayer and contemplation. It had begun earlier with people on own, and then the church fathers descending into the desert fathers, and then became walled space, quarters to live with oratory, church building, dining halls, guest quarters, and things like that. Some of them became quite big, and eventually there was a whole economy around them, and we'll see in chapter 11, 12, and 13. And icons were part of that. And part of their economy was the production of books, like we've seen so far, by monks and nuns and people like that. So this one is from that location. The Virgin is also called a lot of times the Theotokos. Theotokos. I'm not saying that word properly. In your book, quite a lot. That is the Virgin Mary. And this is the child Jesus between saints and angels. Saints Theodore and George. So the guardian saints intercede with the Virgin on behalf of the viewer. So George is the guardian saint. Angels look up to the light of God's presence, and there's a sort of idea of the hand of God right here, so looking up. And the saints' bodies are very much in the Byzantine manner. You can see the feet downward, the sort of elongation and feeling of the spiritual being way more important than the physical. Mary's enthroned between them. Christ's child is a little older than a lot of ones we see, but not too much older. It was done in Egypt, so it's actually Egyptian and Byzantine style in the Syriac tradition. Here, Mount Sinai, Egypt. So, a lot of beautiful patterning in this work on the cloaks. And we see really, really delicate handling of color. Not a wide color palette, but really beautiful Kind of some drapery shown through darkening shadow, but really looking at a lot of purples, blues, and the gold. And depth of space is shown by overlap more than any kind of perspective. I mean, we have an eye level where we're looking up at them as well, which is important. Another icon from the same location, and we'll see a few of these. We already saw one of Christ in Hagia Sophia holding a jeweled gospel book with the jewel cover and the cross, and his right hand on our left, blessing, and a sign of blessing with the halo gold. And then we see a lot of the bearded Jesus here, not the youthful one we saw in earlier chapters, which is, again, an icon that's really important in this tradition. The Orthodox tradition is important icons. So Middle Byzantine, 843 to 1204, is a repeal of iconoclasm, in 843. It's the start of the Middle Era. Ivory carving, manuscript painting continue to be major forms and really continue to develop now that they were more legal and then repealed. And then some Middle Byzantine churches have highly decorated exterior walls compared to like the Hagia Sophia, for example. And we're going to look at an example of that in Greece, which is an interesting place called Monastery of St. Luke, but not Luke the Evangelist, but a local saint in Greece. Monastery of St. Luke. It's Kalanthiklos Hoysolukos. I don't know actually. I'm not saying that word properly, sorry. The church on top is older by a bit, so there's kind of two churches. The one in the picture is the larger and bit newer one. It's actually in a style called cloisonne, which is light stones framed by dark red bricks. You can see here the dark framing it. This word comes from jewelry working, metal working, and we'll see some interesting cloisonne pieces in later chapters in actual metalwork. So it's spelled C-L-O-I-S-O-N-N-E, cloisonne style. Kind of a really beautiful location too, I think. You can see all the detail and the decoration, the round arches and like detail in the windows, and kind of the buttressing being thickened up, holding the walls up, being done really intentionally. Beautiful dome with the light coming in, like we talked about Hagia Sophia. This is made by squinches, sort of another version of pendentives we've talked about. It has pendentives actually in one of them, the older one, I believe, and the squinches in the newer one. They're both central plan churches, the dome on the square, Middle Byzantine. So we're getting kind of more beauty being added to the exterior. You can see the dome and pendentives in the older one and the squinches here. This is the building we're looking at. Interesting the way it talks about in your book how there's two of them kind of side by side. So you see the style we're talking about in their worldview. They're doing it and developing it to really create awe and wonder for their services and for their belief system. They're not doing it just for its own sake. There's also the idea of power and showing power through government and the state by building these beautiful monuments. And you may think to yourself, oh yeah, whatever. People do that back then. They don't do it now. Well, if you ever get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., you'll see that that's actually not the case. We have the Washington Monument, a giant obelisk on a mirrored pond in front of it. We have Lincoln memorials. We have the Vietnam War memorial. There's so many versions of public display of power. If you go to the Centennial Park in Tennessee, you'll see a version of, like we talked about, for the fair, where they made like a version of the Parthenon, right? This is not uncommon even now. The National Cathedral, it goes on and on. So this is a common way of creating culture and talking about your power and what you believe through architecture and works of art. I'm going to look at the interior of another church, Dormition. It's actually means sleep. It's very similar in design to St. Luke in Greece. So these are Greek versions of Byzantium Orthodox buildings. Central plan, monastic church is really high space. You gaze up to rise in the mystery of the surface and space and the darkness of the interiority of the church with these windows that shine light in like a floating dome we've talked about to create visual interest and mystery with the vaulting. So, you ever been in one of these giant spaces, cathedral? It's pretty awe-inspiring. And up in there, before that is there's other types of mosaics around in this space. And this one we're going to look at especially Christ as ruler of all. And he's in the same position with the jeweled book, but not the same hand position. But we get a similar type of bearded, older Christ. A gigantic icon hovering in space, connected to the heavens through Christ, is the idea that we are connected to the heavens through Christ. If you see it coming, looking straight up towards the heavens with the light of God's presence and gold for glory up to Christ, so we're connected through him. The history and the name of the church means sleep. It's a reference to Christ receiving the soul of the Virgin Mary at the moment of her death. An idea. There's a crucifixion mosaic in here as well. It's located in one of the arms of the Greek cross below the vaulting. So if you see back here, this is the middle, and then it goes off into arms of the Greek cross on this church. We'll see it in Venice as well with St. Mark's. Interesting piece. Again, we have a skull below to be the idea of Golgotha, where he was crucified. And, if you've been to Catholic Orthodox churches, a lot of the depictions of Christ are him being crucified, whereas if you've been to a Protestant church, it's usually an empty cross. So different sort of visions of what they're trying to communicate here. The empty cross being more about the resurrection, and this being about identifying with this. Again, the water and blood coming on the side. Here's Mary looking up to her son, and then the Apostle John, who was there, who he said, take her as your mother to take care of her on his death. And then there's the skull being Golgotha, the idea of the pierced hands and feet. Again, gold, and then the dome. There is another sort of repetition here in the mosaic of the architecture and the arch, so that's interesting. It has a painterly naturalism, kind of the late antiquity, dignity and grace is mixed with the Byzantine piety. It's more organic and natural compared with earlier views of like Justinian human representation. They're grounded a little bit more. It feels like more detail. Even though it's patterned and stylized, there's a little bit more feeling of shadowing and depth in the bodies. If not the background, for sure not the background, but in the bodies, there's a little bit more of a solidity, less of a floating quality. Okay, so he is the crucified Christ in this for sure. The water and blood, the hands, the blood coming out. It's idealized, of course, because crucifixion would have been brutally dehumanizing and would have been bleeding everywhere. But still, nonetheless, we know historically crucifixion was really brutal, with being whipped and all kinds of things. We're going to look at some more of Byzantium in the West, how it spread to Italy, the style, especially Venetian version of it with St. Mark's. But Byzantium spread to also Russia through the marriage of Anna, who was a sister of Basil, one of the Macedonian emperors, of, and she married a Russian prince, and so that's how we get a lot of Orthodox churches in Russia in the east, like Ukraine and things. So we have Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. We're seeing the development of all that, and that's coming around the east-west church split that eventually happens that we talk about. This is the interior of St. Mark's in Venice, Italy. It was begun in 1063. Venice was an independent power. Some parts of Italy were under like Lombard control. The Dukes of Venice, or Doges, were an important trade connection between Byzantium and the West, and so they had a lot of power and money. Later on, they encouraged the Crusaders to sack Constantinople, so they weren't really necessarily nice to the Byzantine Empire. It's modeled after the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople and has a cruciform plan with a central dome and 4 domes on each arm of the cross with these high windows. This is the central, to let in light at the base of each of the domes like we saw in Hagia Sophia. Really, really beautiful. We're looking at the apse here, and this is a screen. Later on, we'll see some of these would have had icons on them in some other churches, but this is an early version of the screen between the apse and the regular congregation where the priest is. Fine, costly materials, rich mosaics, lots of gold leafing, and furnished with costly objects like we'll see in the next slide. And you can see the grandeur of these round arches throughout. Symbolisms of, heaven's eternity, gold and light, God's holiness and presence. And the central dome here has Christ ascending into the heavens in the presence of the Virgin Mary and then the 12 apostles. The crossing arches have mosaics of Christ's death and resurrection. So we have a common theme, death, resurrection, and ascension, happening in a lot of the works we've been looking at. And then there's also mosaics of Adam and Eve's liberation from death, which is an important part of the idea of redemption of humanity through Christ's, suffering, death, and resurrection. They had obtained the relics of St. Mark the Evangelist, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, from Egypt, or so it said, and so that's why it's named after them, named after him. And these are the kind of costly objects that would have been. This is a cloisonne style inlaid gems and things and glass and some pieces later. So this is Saint Irene, Empress Irene, I should say. Sorry. So these are like the kind of precious objects they outfitted the church with. Another type of icon of Michael the Archangel, warrior angel here, and the detail in the gold work, silver, gold, cloisonne, enamel. This is melted glass they would put inside these wells that they created. But they definitely outfitted it with the full type of Byzantine luxury that we'll see in other places. Why luxury materials like gold and ivory are used to portray formality and solemnity in art? Well, I think we could say, we'll see a prime example in the next slide, but we could even say on these that the richness and glorious, they're trying to create a richness and show the glory of God and holiness through luxury type of materials, right? This is an interesting example of a triptych, a Haberville triptych. This is an individual's personal piety object. So Middle Byzantium is a portable shrine of private devotion. You can see it's called a triptych because it's in 3 parts. So these 2 parts here, oops, I'm going to do drawing instead of that. These 2 parts here would have been able to fold in because we can see the hinges around. So you could take it with you and then unfold it. It's carved out of elephant ivory. Pretty amazing. It's 9.5 inches by 5.5, so it's not giant. You can see that it is a private sort of object. Three-part triptych opens and closes on hinges, and the middle top is called a supplication scene up here. There's Christ in the middle here, enthroned, right? And he's got John the Baptist and the Virgin pray to him on behalf. So this is the two right here. John the Baptist and the Virgin Mary pray to him on behalf of the person who's in front of the shrine, the triptych. Okay, below are, in the middle, are 5 of the 12 apostles down here. And then on each side, we'll see kind of a grouping that is mirrored. And if you looked at this down the middle, it's very balanced, almost the same. Figure below directly, 2, 2, 2, 2. It's very balanced composition, symmetrically balanced. 5 apostles. There's a hierarchy of how the figures are shown. Christ at the top, most important enthroned. These two figures being the next important ones, and then the apostles, all in the middle. And then on each side, we have 4 full figures and 2 rondellas, you can see, of saints. So they're not as important. They stand like statues, each of them on a pedestal carved into it. This is relief carving. So they're almost like statues of them. Everyone except for Christ, who's kind of like not a statue, but he's on a throne. These guys don't have plinths below them, interestingly. Not sure exactly why they would have distinguished them. It doesn't quite make sense, but that's how the artist chose to do it. They're almost in 3/4 view, so it's interesting because you can see how their faces are turning. And here too. Which is different than the lot of frontal focus we've seen in posing. It's a bit looser and a bit more naturalistic and classical, albeit the feet are still pointed down. There's some feeling of like the body being a little more realistic and classical. So it's some of that's starting to come back in the Middle Byzantine style. We'll see it in the book illuminations and paintings in your book as well. Interesting object, and you can see the clasp. A lot of detail on it, and really, really private. For a private object, if you think about how much wealth this person had and expense to create this, this kind of shows you the idea of what they think of the world, how they think about themselves, the fact that they think they need supplication on behalf of someone else to Christ. So that's part of their worldview, which is not necessarily commonly held by everyone who would be a Christian. The fact that they are identifying with saints and apostles, and there's a hierarchy in their mind of holy people. So interesting ideas that they have represented in this one object, and the care and the craftsmanship in the way in which it's created is pretty immaculate. Here's another painting that has more classical coming back into it. David composing the Psalms, so King David of the Old Testament, the heyday of Israel's kingdom, we could say, building the Temple of Solomon, his son, all this type of stuff. He's here. He's one of the books of the Bible is called Songs, and he wrote a number of them. It's in the Bibliotheca, the Library of France, the national one in Paris. You can see a lot of the revival of that style of classical Greco-Roman coming back in with the way the figure is set in space, turning. This figure here is supposedly another personification of the ideas of melody. Looks over his shoulder, and then over here, Echo appears from behind a column. So, interesting version of a column. We don't have the Greek or Roman capital. The space is kind of an amalgamation of all kinds of people. His dog, who's his faithful servant, he was a shepherd, which is why we saw Christ, him being shown as a shepherd, and Christ talks about being a shepherd. So there's a commonality there of the idea of gathering sheep, the goats, and things. He's got them around him, so he's out in the wilderness, so to speak. Um, he's a reclining male figure here, has the inscription that I down there that identifies him as the Mount of Bethlehem, so the city of David, where Christ was born. So there's a lot of personification happening. It's dated to the Macedonian Renaissance, a time of, here it is right here, enthusiastic and careful study of the literature of ancient Greece and humanistic ideas, and that's kind of kept the classical style alive in the Middle Ages in works like this that we'll see emerge again later in Renaissance and things like that. So it's interesting the way in which the style continues. We're going to examine some icons. We're almost done with this chapter of purpose and style. Some of them are in Russian icon painting that it gets to a really high level. Pretty beautiful works. Next one is really beautiful piece. Virgin and child icon, the Vladimir Virgin, because it's in Vladimir, Russia. That's where it was taken to. Today it's in a gallery in Moscow. It's got tempera, which is egg as a binder, and pigment. The Virgin has the long, thin nose and small mouth, characteristic of some of the icons there. And you can see the child. There's like a really sweet, tender moment of connection here, cheek to cheek. Part of what makes it beautiful. Golden rays are in the infant Jesus' clothing. The idea of God's presence and light is really intimate, compassionate mother, though. That's the subject matter more than anything. Probably one of the most renowned Middle Byzantine icons produced in Russia. Named after, like I said, in 1155, Vladimir, Russia, where it was taken. It's actually been painted over a number of times because of damage and things to it, so we don't get so much of the original image. And it was believed to be, we talked about some icons believed to be wonder working, and so ideas of this one save cities from invasion, so important to them culturally because of that reason as well. We're going to go into late Byzantine, which takes us from 1261 up to the end of the Byzantine Empire when the Ottomans invaded. There's a couple really important events that happen in this era that you should know about that really changed the history of it. One of them is the Western Crusades invaded in 1203 and 1204. The Venetians convinced some of them who were crusaders to divert from the war in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, where they were trying to defeat the Saracens, the Muslims, from taking over the city. And that's the terminology of the era. So they were persuaded to attack and sack Constantinople in 1203 and 1204. That was a really important thing that happened. And pretty crappy because, who wants to get sacked anyway? But even more so, the Crusades were a pretty terrible part of history. Lots of really crappy things happened. Amongst them, shows that they were really a lot about greed because Western Christian cities were attacking Eastern Christian cities, which shows that it wasn't so much necessarily for everyone who's involved about actually taking back the Holy Land as much as it was about just getting the wealth. Another important thing is Byzantium was split into 3 kingdoms and then split in 3, and then defeated in 1453. End of the last era. And then some Turks, the Seljuk Turks, conquered most of Anatolia, an area the Ottomans would come out of east of, and then that was an important thing that basically rose up this other big empire that took out Byzantium. And then the East-West church split is a really important historical moment. So in 1054, East-West church split. This is an important moment in history for a lot of reasons. Development of not just religious tradition, but the world history and the way that the Eastern Church became the Orthodox Church and then the Western became Roman Catholic. So before that, we had one universal little c Catholic Church, and then this time it became Eastern Orthodox and Western Roman Catholic Church, which would affect world history quite substantially. And you had you had the popes on one hand and then other different types of leaders on the other side. There's a lot of complicated reasons why this happened that we don't have time to go into, but important. And then later on, out of the Roman Catholic came Protestantism and a bunch of subsequent things, denominations that will affect later history quite substantially. So the other thing is we kind of getting different types of paintings going on through this period, and some change of power. The rule passed from Macedonian, that was the dynasty around Basil I, to a Achaemenian dynasty. So there's a kind of vision of the world that the spiritual world that's unsusceptible to change despite the changes around them that we've been seeing in the work. Interesting ideas. And we're going to see some beautiful painting from this period of time in the 14th and 15th century, icons that are really beautiful. We get a consistent style that's unchanging despite the changes in the world, because our vision of who Christ is and spirituality isn't changing based on politics, which is maybe a good thing, actually, for the solidity of their culture and their belief system. It's got material up here that's different. Finely etched silver foil that's been really finely engraved. And then we have the similar type idea we saw on the Mount Sinai bejeweled Bible, blesses with the right hand, and the halo, but done in a silver foil. It has quite a bit of flatness in the garments. They look like they're placed on the figure almost, compared to the neck and face that are getting a lot more naturalism. So it's an interesting combination of that flatness and strange perspectives in the book with a really naturalistic face that gives a real humanness to Christ. These were icons that were used in processionals to be carried. And so on the other side of this is actually a crucifixion. And that's interesting because it reveals a lot about Byzantine spirituality, that they use these icons and transition them throughout the service in processionals, and they would put them on, they would be on the doors, like little doors on the screen that was between the apse and the nave. It's called a templon. We showed you one earlier in St. Mark's, but these ones with all the icons put on them were called iconostasia because of the icons put on there. And there's another example of one from the same place. It's the same set of icons. The Virgin on the front is the scene of the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel tells her that she'll be the Mother of God, the Virgin Mother of God. And then on the back, there's another scene. This gesture is showing of astonishment and sort of reluctance, like how could this be? And the simple architectural kind of props that are used around to show place. Not so much naturalism in this one, but we have a lot of beauty in the way the angel is shown, and we have some of it because look, we're getting some of the feeling of the figure below the clothing, which we didn't see as much of that. Well, earlier in the chapter, if you remember, there was more like a flat garment that had a lot of maybe surface decoration and patterning. But this is a feeling of the figure inside the clothing more, happening even with Mary as well. She's enthroned, which is interesting, obviously because they value her, not because she would have been on a throne when the Gabriel came to her in the Bible narratives. There's an otherworldly gold everywhere, right? They're seeing this otherworldly backgrounds. So, albeit these narratives are told in style of historic actual events and history and places, they're giving us an otherworldly vision of them. And so they're not grounding it necessarily in the world of Judea, Galilee, or the world of even Byzantium exactly. There's some of the idea of it with architecture, but overall very otherworldly vision of spirituality and mystery. Interesting last one we're going to look at, called The Three Angels, a Russian icon painting. We actually know the artist here, Rublev, sorry. Aga's binder on pigment, tempera again. Russian icons usually had a lot of strong lines and patterns and intense contrasting colors to heighten their legibility in the wavering candlelight and clouds of incense in these type of services, with a lot of kind of feeling of mysticism, maybe you could say. Not exactly the right word, but you have these contrasting purple and yellow, a flatness to the wings, and strong line work. This is from an interesting, almost, the perspective is very interesting, the way it goes away here and shows the chairs. It's almost like isometric, but it's not. It's very mixed, weird perspective and a feeling of architecture in the background. It's from, there's an interesting use in his work of color, saturation, and harmonies that are characteristic of his style, and he's considered one of the better ones of this era and style. It's from the Old Testament, that the three angels, which are often by some people said to be the Trinity or God with two angels, coming to Abraham to tell him he would have Isaac despite his age, the son of promise, like we talked about. So this is a really interesting piece, and I think is really beautiful in its depiction of the elongated spiritual figures, the turning in space in an interesting way, and the way the green and red and blue and orangish yellow are mixing together and served food. So there's a kind of beauty in this that's, albeit the space is not necessarily realistic, there's a naturalism. We can tell that these are, figures, but it's interesting the way that he's depicted this. So you have a discussion question. You're gonna and tell me in what ways are spiritual ideas expressed in Byzantine art, and you're going to want to go over, you're going to pick one or at the most two pieces of art and use specific visual examples to explain it. So if you picked this piece, you could talk about a lot of things we've been talking about, the way the colors are used, the wings. These would be good pieces with the otherworldly gold, the Annunciation. You could talk about blessing, the Bible, the halos, the naturalism. There's a lot of things you could talk about, but you're going to want to come into a lot of the themes from a single piece, which we've been talking about a lot, with the way in which there's a hierarchy, the way people float, the spiritual being more important than the physical. And you have a lot of different pieces you could pick to do this that have strong motifs. I mean, most of the art we've looked at has a lot of religious. This would be a great piece to pick. Lots to talk about. So you got to really hone in on it and use some specific visual examples. What do I mean by that? Well, you could say something like the purple and the yellow, right? Because it's royalty. You have to use things like the spear and the side, the halos, the gold, the light. Not just talk about, oh, this is what they thought spiritually and da-da-da, I'm done. No, but use the imagery to make your points. So that's the important thing to figure out in your writing. You've been doing some good writing, so I look forward to seeing what you have to say. take care out there, and I will talk to you soon. As ever, if you have any questions, please contact me in all the many ways. Messaging me on Canvas, using the discussion boards, Pronto, emailing me. Ideally, I prefer to be messaged through Canvas rather than email, because it won't get lost in the many other emails I get from the college. All right, talk to you guys later.